Hello.
Hey David, how's it going?
Good. Just getting my audio and stuff set up.
Cool.
Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Your background is great. I remember it from the other ones, but I like it.
Thanks. Yeah, I could like rotate it, but this one's just so good.
Once we read a new scroll, you can put the next one up.
There you go. That makes sense.
So is there a list of questions you have somewhere that we're following, or
We don't have any yet. I'm going to see people show up and ask in YouTube chat, or I think we could probably, once we all get on, get started just talking about what we're up to, kind of update
okay,
people on what the team's doing, and then we'll see if we get questions. We might just hang out and chat about scrolls for a while, and that's fine too.
sounds good.
I think, I have YouTube chat up. I have Discord just in case. But you can help me.
Oh, where is there? Yeah. How do I pull up the YouTube chat? Oh, there's probably a link in the announcements.
Yep, that'll do it. Anton's watching. Hi, Anton. Oh, here's Ben and Julian. That was on me. Waiting
Yeah.
room duties.
Ben was asking.
Cool. Here we go. Hello, everyone.
Can you see me?
Not right now.
I could very briefly for like a frame, and now you're gone again. I can't see or hear Julian yet. There you
Oh
are.
yeah.
How's it going?
Yeah, good, thanks. Sweet. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Yeah, sweet.
Julian, are you there?
Hi.
Hi,
Okay.
there you are.
Sweet.
Hey,
Perfect.
Julian.
Hi there.
Um, I think this is everyone that we know is attending. We'll see if anyone else shows up, and you all can help me. I'm trying to keep an eye on the Zoom waiting room and also primarily YouTube chat where we're getting some questions, but also Discord just in case. So I think I have an eye on those things, but let me know if I'm missing something. Um, we've got a couple questions. I think we can just jump in particular because one of them is sort of introductory anyways. Maxim has asked, so what kind of people are on the team now? So that's about as good as an opportunity as any, I think, for us each maybe just to say who we are. Most of us probably in one way or another have uh, introduced ourselves on various forums, but here we are in this one. So here's part of the team I can lead. My name's Steven, and I'm the project lead right now. My background is computer science, and I did my PhD over the last few years in this, what became this project, basically. So I worked on, in particular, I focused mostly on the problem of trying to use machine learning to detect the ink in these scans where we have this, what we thought was maybe a so-called invisibility problem, where the carbon ink of the Herculaneum scrolls resembles in X-ray very much the carbonized papyrus. So we have like a, it's not very much good contrast. But there is some subtle difference there that we're trying to extract using machine learning. So I spent a long time doing that. We launched Vesuvius Challenge last year, and now I'm helping run the project. So that's my background. Who's next?
Oh yeah, sure. My name is Ben. I'm the segmentation team lead. My background is math and computational neuroscience, and just been in the startup scene for a little while. And now I'm here. I'm really excited to be here. Yeah. That's all.
I'll go next. My name's David. I'm also a segmenter. My background, I did a PhD in some solar tech. More related, I did some micro CT back in the day on cow bones. And that's what drew me to the project. It gave me some context. But yeah, most of my time is spent trying to follow the sheets in the scroll and the CT data.
Hi there, I'm Julian. My background is computer science and also robotics. Well, last year I was a contestant, and this year I'm helping developing the software, so software engineer here.
Great. Maxim asked a follow-up, is my PhD finished? Yes, I finished it last year. So this is now my full-time thing, is running Vesuvius Challenge with these folks. There are some questions here about data that I think are good, because this is something I hoped we would get to talk about today. I'll jump into it. One of the first ones, some of these grouped together a little bit, but someone has asked, do the CT scanners have only a certain amount of dynamic range? These scans are 16-bit values, but as far as I can tell, only the highest 4 to 5 bits contain useful data. And the follow-up says, for example, if you zero out the high bits, or you look at what you might call bit planes of the images, you can see a pattern indicating papyrus, but after those first few bits, it's all noise. Then we also have some questions just about data size, which is related in terms of terabytes, because perhaps not everyone has 4 to 8 terabytes sitting around of fast drives that they want to fill with all of this data, or the compute power to handle that. So why is the data in that format? What is the size now? What do we hope to do with it? I can speak to this some, and anyone else can jump in anytime. The first one is about the dynamic range and also the bit precision of the CT scanners. And this varies based on the instrument or based on the acquisition time. But in general, a couple of things are true. One is that it's pretty standard just to use 16-bit uncompressed to make sure you capture everything when sort of rendering the volume in its reconstructed form, although the original values are floats. So what we see in these volumes, we in the past and up to the present have stored as 16-bit integers. We've sort of picked that window arbitrarily, or we window the original float range arbitrarily to fit it into a 16-bit space. And the original values in the float space are not the same as those integers. So we've remapped from what were small decimals usually, including some in the negatives, to this 0 to 2 to the 16 range. So the original values are floats. We preserve them as best practice. I will say it does seem true from this observation and what we've seen on our side as well, that probably we don't need all 16 of those bits. So that raises some questions about other data formats we might use going forward that are more efficient for all of us in a few ways, one of which is, and the primary one would be storage. But also read times and things like that are important. So uncompressed is nice because it's simple. We know for sure that it captures all of the signal. While we do more learning about the data we've got, we're not accidentally destroying signal. But I am confident, like you've noted, that we're probably going to find that we can get away with less. And if it's only 5 or 6 bits of useful data, then that's convenient because we could use only those, or more likely we could just use 8-bit since it's a well-supported structure, and we would still know that captures everything. We take a lot of care to try to capture everything, especially given the machine learning nature of the ink detection here. since it's really cluing in on we don't know what exactly. And we want to make sure we're feeding it every bit of signal it could possibly be fed. And so even if some of that visually looks like noise, if there's any chance of it containing data, we want to be able to use that. But there are ways to take a look at this, and I think we'll find a similar conclusion that you have. So what does that look like going forward? I think what we're going to try to do as a team is put together some data processing pipelines that we can maintain and run on our end. So these wouldn't require your storage or compute, but they could be community contributed. And this pipeline would allow anyone on our team or in the community to contribute data transformations where we will store the original raw data on our end, always out of principle, but we can create multiple derived formats that might be more effective, more efficient, smaller, more compressed, etc. So what we can do is have for each volume, we'll store the raw data, but we can build pipelines where we're automatically regenerating these derived formats that are perhaps 8 or fewer bits and might be compressed. And maybe they're chunked instead of just stored in slices, things like that. Or maybe they're masked to contain only the scroll. We've seen bits of all of this in different contributions. So we want to bring that together, allow it to be a community resource, and then we can use our own compute to generate those, and then people could hopefully access them. Does anyone else on the team want to add to that train of thought?
Well, we're gonna rerun it maybe every few weeks or something, so it stays up to date, I guess.
Yeah. I'll add there are a couple of different data types that this could end up applying to. One of them, and maybe the most obvious, is the volumes. So those are where these questions were generated, since we're talking about 16-bit values, just the original CT volumes. And those are the largest assets that we have and that contestants have to navigate. So I think reducing the resources required to deal with those would be great. But there's also other data types. So we also have now, we render what we call surface volumes per segmentation. And those we could also make more efficient in the same way that we store the volumes as 16-bit TIFFs. So far, we've largely been doing the same with surface volumes. There's been discussion from the community and some of the team members on this call about doing really simple initial steps like storing those slices as JPEGs and just using lossy compression. And initial experiments suggest that it still works fine. We know that some information is lost in that process, but it dramatically reduces the size of the surface volumes by maybe a factor of 10.
Even
And
20.
10 or 20, even more. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then it looks like probably ink detection with the data we have still works within the error bounds of our perception anyways. Julian, do you want to say more about that?
Yeah, so I ran some experiments there. So JPEG is really a nice format. You can just open it with your computer. Just a simple image tool will open it. So it's quite accessible and the data is a lot less. So compression level 60 gives good results still for ink detection. And visually, if I compare like to a TIFF and a JPEG, you can see the difference, but it's not that bad. So there's probably also a way, but we can do lossless compression and also lossy compression. And probably lossy compression is fine up to a certain amount.
Yeah. So I think what I'd like to see and would love to hear feedback on this idea is we've talked in different conversations, usually on Discord with community members, about different formats that might fit here. And for example, on the volume front, some chunked formats are really nice. We've seen multiple tools that have started to use OME-ZAR and similar things. Or we've also chunked the volumes using other formats. What we'd really like isn't necessarily to invest all in on any one of those formats. We'd like to kind of build this pipeline where people could write their own conversion scripts that could just get ingested, and then we could generate multiple formats and host and serve those. So hopefully it's flexible, and hopefully we stand that up. I'd like to stand it up within a week or so. It'll start bare bones. We can add to it. There is one data type we haven't really talked about this for, but that I think could also be interesting, which is the meshes themselves. Those, even the meshes, are sometimes not the smallest files. And I think if we want to work towards really interactive visual tools that might load, for example, all the segmentations in a single view without super heavy-handed downloading or rendering, we might look into multi-level of detail meshes. Now that's something I'm not super well educated on, so I don't know which actual file formats we might investigate yet. But if anyone out there is looking for a fun project, I think that could be one. Anyone else have any thoughts on this topic?
I'll just say, yeah, that makes sense because our current, like the point sets that we're making are downsampled anyway, on
Right.
processing. So yeah.
Cool. While we're on the, I'll go back to the beginning of this question just to talk a bit more about the dynamic range while we have the question. Says the scans are 16-bit. Like I mentioned, the original scans are in float space, and that's common for any instruments I've seen. Either benchtop instruments or doing this on a synchrotron. Usually you start with floats. And typically the reconstruction is done using an algorithm called filtered back projection. And the output of filtered back projection doesn't have units in any physical sense that's particularly useful. So a brightness of a particular value doesn't mean anything physically or chemically. These are relative density values. But there is one value that is sort of special, and that's 0 in the reconstructed float space. So when we do the reconstruction using the initial projection images, we get this volume in float space where some of the values are negative or just below 0. And according to the principles of reconstruction, we really shouldn't have negative values. So the presence of negative values is essentially error that propagates through the reconstruction process, which is standard. Often you would clip that to 0, which would mean in a projection image like the one behind me, error would be black. Error should always be essentially 0 attenuation in these scans. If you've looked at the volumes or the data that we are serving, if you actually just open one of the TIFF images, it's not adjusted in quite this way. So error is actually much more gray than black like this. And that's because we choose when we window the float space to 16 bits, not to clip at 0. That's a little bit untraditional. And the reason we do that is the same reason I mentioned earlier regarding not knowing exactly what signal the machine learning based ink detection is using and wanting to give it as much as possible. So we know 16 bits is more than we need, and we know therefore that there's no real need to clip. So we just include the negative values, even though aesthetically they would look better if they were black, just in case there's any signal in that noise, essentially. So that's that. I can go to some more questions. One thing I do want while we're all here to do is I might prime some of the segmentation team if either of you are willing or both of you. I think it'd be fun, and I'm not sure if we've really done it in a form like this, just to look briefly at the different scrolls we have and how their structure varies, how the papyrus seems to look differently. Is that something you all might be able to just show a slice from each and talk through for a minute? Not right this second, but given a few minutes to prepare.
Sure.
Cool.
I think I have most of the volumes loaded,
Um,
except scroll 4.
Cool. I'll go back to wrap up some thoughts on the data side. Someone asked kind of specifically how to manage the data sets if they don't have as much compute or perhaps storage. And like I mentioned, we're hoping to alleviate this going forward by making the data sets smaller. We also would really like to, or I at least think this would be interesting, to offer these data sets as sort of streaming capability, which really is already the case. Like we host these files on a file server, and we could build applications that instead of downloading the entire volume to your computer, dynamically pull the parts of the volume that you need. I think that this is already technically possible, although the slices you're downloading are still pretty big individually. With compressed and chunked formats, I think this would be much more feasible. So there are other tools. One that comes up every once in a while is called NeuroGlancer that I think is amazing. And it's a browser-based visualization tool for terabyte and larger volumes. And it's not downloading the entire volume, it's just grabbing little bits at a time that you need to visualize. So that's a model that I really love to emulate. And on our end, we can help support that by at least hosting the right file types. For now, what you can do if you're limited on disk space is I think a lot of these open questions and the frontiers of the sort of prizes and research problems here are addressable without entire volumes. So if you are specifically limited on how much disk space you have, but you want to contribute, I would encourage you to maybe ask in the Discord what are some of the sub problems you might focus on, and we can help direct you because you can download just part of a volume. You certainly don't need to download an entire scroll volume to get started. A lot of research can be done with a single slice or maybe a handful of slices, which hopefully is more approachable.
I have scroll one ready to go.
Cool.
We'll look at that now.
Let's take a look if you're willing. I think, yeah, in particular, once we get to like 3, that's quite interesting, but it helps to have seen
Can you see
1
that?
to compare. Yes, I
Yep.
can see that.
Cool. Yeah, so this is scroll one. This is where we have red text from. And the main areas that we had success segmenting are towards the center. Well, the areas toward the outside. You can see as I scroll through it are much different and a little less separated. Some are compressed. The waves that you see rolling through tend to affect the middle less. But yeah, this is the scroll that we have had success reading. And when you see the other ones, you might understand why.
Are you able, David, in this interface to zoom in and show maybe an example of like a vertical papyrus fiber and a horizontal one? And what constitutes, what we believe at this point constitutes like a single sheet of papyrus? Because this is something that when we launched the challenge, I didn't have very well formed. I thought actually my mental picture of what one sheet of papyrus was, it's quite a bit different than it is now.
Well, we can't see fibers from this view.
Well, you might be able to see one kind of appear, one of the front ones appear and disappear. Just looking for.
You can see the intersection of the vertical ones, right? They kind of appear as dots, more or less.
The vertical ones are the ones that persist because they're all the way up the scan. Whereas the horizontal ones,
right?
Sometimes you get to a gap between them and they appear and disappear.
I think a little bit to the left of your mouse, you can see that the vertical ones. Or at the top, no.
Okay.
They are floating in free space, or what is this?
This right here might be a calysis, actually. I don't know for
cool.
sure, but where the two
And
papyrus sheets join together. It ends here and then continues. Not seeing any good examples immediately of like a horizontal fiber and a vertical fiber.
I guess, yeah, horizontal wouldn't really display in this view, but
I'm thinking maybe where my mouse is now, this bump that appears and then disappears, could be an example of
a vertical fiber.
Well, the vertical ones should stay the whole for every slice because they go up, whereas the horizontal fibers come into view and then you hit the gaps between them with the slices.
It looks to me like here might be a vertical one, right? If you go back some slices. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, that could be one.
Maybe.
Anyways, this gives just a visual example of the primary scroll all of us have been staring at for the last year.
Yeah.
To
And in this
contrast,
data,
perhaps with the next visual. Go ahead.
but in this data, all the wraps you see are in one piece of papyrus, which is the two pieces hammered together to create as they make the papyrus. And so it doesn't appear that any papyrus here is separating just to any extent. And we might see that in the other scrolls happening quite a bit. So this is very clean. Every single wrap is a single sheet. And it won't be the case in the next images we see.
Yeah, I had thought for a while that
Ah,
during the
so I can-
carbonization process, the sheets had actually delaminated. And I thought even looking at images like this, that what appeared to be multiple sheets was actually one that had delaminated into two or more. But it seems from what we've learned that what you're saying is probably true, that there's no broad delamination of sheets. For the most part, what appears here as a sheet is a sheet. Is that more or less what you're saying?
Yeah.
I loaded up one of the 5753 segment just so you can see a trace of what one sheet is compared to what's in between. Wow. Speed things up a bit to go through the harder parts. Yeah, so these waves rolling through is what happened when the sheet isn't going close to perpendicular to the slice. You're doing it more along the sheet, so that it looks like they're flatter in 2D than they are. This is where the last
These
full
segmentations
column.
are amazing.
This is where the
So
last full column of this row was.
this segmentation in red is the last full column?
Yeah. It's really nice towards the top, a little more clear, I think, as the exterior wraps kind of fall off towards the top.
And just out of my curiosity, does this correspond more or less to a single column?
Yes.
So we're looking at like
Yeah.
3.5 wraps or so.
Yeah, it really depends on the radius from the center.
Cool.
Through wraps to it. I think through wraps much farther out is actually 2 columns towards the end of our grand prize banner. Yeah, we want to look at a different scroll.
Yeah, if you have, well, anything that you would like to show, I think it'd be fun to show scroll 3 and maybe hear from you all what you make of it at this stage, because it seems like we're still trying to wrap our heads around it a little bit. But really, any of them would be illustrative.
I scroll 2 immediately, able to pull up, and you can see the contrast between the 2 scrolls and why this one is so much more difficult.
So there's multiple things going on here. Some of them I know for sure, so I can mention, but then I'm curious to hear, since you've probably spent more time looking at it, which of these are factors. So one thing going on here is that during the actual scan, there was a miscalculation in one of the geometric offsets that meant that central, what appears as a circle here, it's really a cylinder through the scan volume, was just not acquired. That's why we have that artifact. And it does bleed out a little bit through these lines into the surrounding data. So near that center bit, we know there's, that's not ideal. That's one thing. Another is that the layers are super compressed in this scroll, even where the data appears sharper. That seems to be true. And then what I think is true, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. I believe this one is more crumpled. So in addition to being compressed, the layers are less perpendicular to the slice plane than was true in scroll 1. which makes them look even more compressed and even worse than they might actually be with better visualization. What do you think?
Yeah, that's especially true for the top 5,000 slices or two. You just have the waves going all over the place because that's where the scroll was crushed and bent out of plane.
Mm. I also did some exploration there. And well, the umbilicus, the center, it's this bright white spot most of the scrolls in the most slices, and it goes all like that. It goes all over the place. It's also on the bottom left sometimes.
And yeah, I guess just the fact that that moves around would suggest pretty major crumpling, right?
I guess so.
Along the major axis. There are places where if you pause on any of these, it actually appears
Fully
this
orthogonal.
one. Yeah, you can actually see the grid-like pattern because you've gone all the way to being in plane with the papyrus sheet. This slice, I don't see it super strongly, but a number of them have shown it.
There.
Yeah.
You have to look closely, but you can see it.
Yeah, so that almost looks like you've, segmented that surface.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. If anyone wants to look for letters, it's a free sheet right there, essentially.
But I don't well understand. I mean, for that to look orthogonal, and then it's got this sort of fissure on either end of it, adjacent to sheets that seem to be going in a much different direction. I have not wrapped my head around the geometry of what's really going on here.
Mm.
As to why papyrus between two orthogonal sheets could be bent out of plane.
Yeah, we have this region sort of sandwiched between.
So you can kind of follow it from the side. That might help.
Yeah. I would
It
just
looks like
expect, I
fully
guess,
right
more
angle.
gradual transition, but it's like a really sharp transition between a sheet that is intersecting the plane and then a sheet that is seemingly parallel to the plane. It's the sharp transition that I don't fully grasp.
I think
Obviously,
when it got crushed, I guess part of it gave, but not the entire scroll gave, and for whatever reason, it forced that part of the scroll to get a little bit wider as it crushed the middle into it. But why it got crushed that way, I don't know.
yeah.
Crumpled paper looks a little bit random, even when you just ball it in your hand. So
While we have this view, I'll just use this to stand on one of my soapboxes, which is I think with this data, there are cases where it's much more tractable than it appears. Like here, where the compressed layers are going sort of in the middle of the image, where they're going, presumably, yes, this region. If not perpendicular to the slice plane, they at least intersect it somehow. But you can barely distinguish them at all. It looks like one big blob of papyrus, which feels pretty much impossible from this view. But I think if intersected the other way, you get something that looks more like the region a little bit up and to the right, where actually there are fibers present that can be followed. So I'm hopeful that we can actually make more sense of this data than it appears from this view.
Yeah, there's kind of two ways I think to do that, and one is you're able to segment along off axis, so you can look at this differently. And another way to do that would be to this is talking manually. Another way to do that would be to straighten it. Use the Hughes volume warping we were looking at the other day, and actually straighten the scroll out. And so you have this nice straight thing, and then just have like a bijection back into this original data set. And both ways should allow us to manually get into this.
And you mean by the latter, essentially a volume warp that would sort of undo the crumpling, but leave the scroll rolled up as a scroll?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That Hughes paper, I think is potentially kind of how you do that. And then, but you would still have a bijection back into the points back into the original data set for actually doing computations. So there's an extra computational step, but it should change how we look at it. Yeah. Anyway.
We've had some questions about the text and their availability. Yeah, basically we make those available as soon as we can from our partners. So the images that show ink, we, at least with the work to date on Scroll One, have been partnering with our papyrology team who are doing their work with those images. And as soon as that's made available to us, we will share that work. But as another commenter mentioned, there's simultaneously people taking an interest in this in the Discord community. So there have been people doing papyrology there and making sense of the text. So both should be true. We have the one is sort of faster and more up to date. You can just jump into community discussion for the textual interpretation. And then the other is a slightly slower process, but has been going faster than is standard for that field. The results from last year's first letters and the columns that surround it are available now in a formal papyrological paper that's open access, which is much, much faster and more available than we often see. So we're excited about that. Other questions, let's see. Someone has asked any insights into what the caked deposits on scroll 4 are. They are annoyingly similar to scroll 1 crackle, but seem more like mud that has leaked into the scroll. Who has thoughts on this one?
Well, we know scroll 4 was manually unrolled partially, so that could have introduced some contaminants one way or the other. But as to what those are,
Right. Ben, are you about to give thoughts?
No, it's very small. It's like the size of your finger. And so it's just
Yeah.
the very center of some larger scroll. And looking at it, like you look at the photographs of it, it's more, there's more space, it's more flayed. As it looks like in the data set, it looks like in real life. But yeah, that's a big question. What is that signal? Because it doesn't seem to correspond to letter shapes. Yeah.
Yeah.
$1 million question.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know any more than anyone else does who's weighed in. We all share this question. So yeah, we've seen the same thing you're noting, which is there is a lot on scroll 4 of what appears to be crackle. It has the same pattern that in scroll 1 corresponds to ink, but in scroll 4 it seems to just blanket large regions, if not most of the entire scroll. Can you all fact check me on that? Is it most of the whole scroll that has this pattern from what we've seen?
from what yeah, I think that's fair to say.
Yeah, so most of the scroll surface is covered in this. We don't know what it is. My completely, just my guess, based on no great evidence, is that it's something having to do with the eruption and the initial burial and damage of the scroll. It seems unlikely, despite what we, despite some of the destruction we know happened with the physical methods. I'd personally be surprised if this scroll got enrolled in a way that managed to deposit that all over the interior wraps.
No, that's no way.
But it's not impossible. I mean, a lot of methods were tried with these scrolls that were destructive and would have penetrated. People tried different liquid approaches. Some scrolls were immersed in mercury at one point, although that basically just completely destroyed them. We don't have anything left to work with from those cases, to my knowledge. It is something we could probably we could at least consult the papyrologist and determine what is known about the physical unrolling of this scroll, if anything. It might shed a bit of light on that.
Deposits from being submerged. That's interesting. Could it be a painting? I'm just curious. Could it be like a picture?
Technically, anything's possible. There's no, to my knowledge, precedent for that in the collection, but that doesn't, you can't prove the negative, right? Like, could be. It seems though, yeah, it just seems like the whole sheet's just covered, right? It's not even particularly isolated to picture-like forms. It's just a big black rectangle.
I don't remember it being that consistent. I remember, just these bits and splotches and stuff.
So the jury's still out on this one.
David, you've looked at your segments you've made. What do you think?
whether it's a painting or a picture.
No. How much coverage there is of this sort of
Well, I
crackle
would
like?
say it's throughout, but it's not like 100%. It's like sparsely covering
Yeah.
at least the height of the segments I've made.
Does it ever appear pictorial in nature?
Not that I've looked for.
No.
Yeah, I will say there are examples in the open Herculaneum papyri of diagrams. It's
Yeah.
limited. Most of the collection, the vast majority, is textual. There are some examples of diagrams. I'm not aware of any examples of more artistic, broad illustrations, but who knows?
There are some
It,
examples of much bigger letters, right? If
I don't
there's like
know.
that.
That could be. In general, my feeling on this is, despite not knowing what it is, it's indicative of the way these scrolls are pretty varied. Despite all coming from the same collection, they came from the same library. Obviously, they were buried by the same volcano. But the scrolls on the shelves did represent 3 centuries of physical material. So they were in differing condition for various reasons prior to the eruption, which means they're all papyrus and they're all a similar ink composition, but the specifics of both of those vary and the script changes. There's just a lot we don't know yet about that variance. And it makes it tricky, perhaps, to train a model on, for example, just a single scroll and expect that it will work across all of them. I'm excited by this because as we learn more about the individual scrolls and sort of unlock them and figure out what ink looks like on that one, this all gets absorbed into the iteratively improving models that we're training that will become more and more generalizable. So once we crack this case, we get that one for free next time, if that makes sense. So I think that's exciting long term. But yeah, for now, it's a bit frustrating because we don't know yet what we're looking at.
I can't wait to see more scrolls because these four are very different. And so I'm curious
Yep.
to see sort of categorically, once we've done 7, 10, at what point are we like, oh, okay, we start seeing categories emerge and
Yeah,
things.
that's a good point.
That's
Like
right.
we're sampling a distribution here and we have like 4 samples, so we don't really
Yeah,
know much
yeah,
about the actual
yeah.
distribution.
They're
We don't know.
beautiful data sets.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah.
Let's see. Yusef has asked, well, let's continue that discussion while we're on the subject. Someone asks, so you can't use the crackle method on at least one of the scrolls, presumably meaning scroll 4 that we just mentioned. I'll say my thought on that and then you all can weigh in. It doesn't seem like it maps exactly. I would not go as far as to say that we can't use it. It may be that we're not looking for the right thing yet. I mean, one thing that was interesting last year is a lot of people stared a lot at scroll 1 before seeing this crackle pattern that now seems obvious and all of us can sort of spot. But you have to know what to look for, and that initial discovery took some time. So I'm hopeful that we'll have a similar thing here, where once we clue into and sort of hone in on whatever the next signal is, which maybe is crackle-like, maybe has a bit of a different appearance, there may be a similar approach that works about as well as identifying crackle does on scroll 1. We
And
just
let's
don't know
not
yet.
rule out multi-channel techniques. Right.
Like
Maybe that's
multi-energy
part of.
scans.
Yeah. Maybe there is
Yep.
just the ever so subtle difference that we just need the right energies to pull it out.
That's very possible.
Texture isn't the only thing that we have to go on, theoretically.
Yeah, that's a good point. And to go back, one of the themes of this conversation today has been the data and sort of the formats and the way it's being served. And we've talked about some of the things we're trying to work on as a team is improving the quantity and the structure of that data for the community to make it a bit more accessible. So another way that we're doing that is we do still have scans actually that we're still processing from last year that we will continue to release. And those will build out a really nice data set that's really the first of its kind, where we will have for multiple scrolls and fragments, a multi-resolution, multi-energy data set for each of those. And there's like a ton of work and processing to get all that out. And then there's work that still isn't even really done to make them all aligned. So we may get to a point, actually, we already have gotten to a point where we've requested this in our wish list for community contributions for progress prizes. But aligning those volumes precisely is important, and we can kind of do it now, but it's labor intensive. And these are all things that as they improve, these data sets are going to become amazing, where we can take for any given region within one of these scrolls, we can say, what does this look like at 8 micron, 53 kilo electron volts? What does it look like at 8 micron, 88 kilo electron volts? Or ultimately, we can actually just take all of these different forms from the same spot and just feed it, like you're saying, as a multi-channel input to a neural network where we don't even have to really do much on the front end or the cognitive end to determine which of those is better. We can just experimentally determine not only which of those has the strongest ink signal, but whether the combination is better than the sum of its parts.
Well, and one of the really sort of exotic problems there is from what we have in the scans we have, can we infer what optimal energy levels would be going forward?
Yeah.
What flexibility do we have to choose energies at Oxford in upcoming scans? What are our options there?
It's pretty flexible. So, well, within a certain constrained window. So when we scan these at the synchrotron, we use what's called a monochromator. So there's a beam going around the synchrotron that is wiggled to generate an X-ray beam. And that X-ray beam initially is a so-called white beam, which means it has all of these energies and more. And there are multiple physical filters in the beam path that remove parts of that beam for various purposes. For example, it has a high flux of low energy X-rays, which despite being low in kilo electron volts, there's a lot of them. Since they're low energy, they're not particularly useful for imaging, but since there's a lot of them, they still heat things up. So there are filters in the path of the beam that attenuate those and remove them. And that piece of filter gets really hot and is like liquid cooled, for example. But that removes a large component of the beam so that it doesn't just heat up the sample for no reason or the detector. Then that white beam is filtered down in our case because the white beam itself is just too much energy for these samples. We filter it down to a single energy level, and that gives us a window. I'm not actually sure the bounds at diamond light source, but I think on the lower end it's around 53 kilo electron volts. I think it could go, we've taken scans up as high as maybe 109. Likely it can go higher, but we've noticed that those scans really get quite noisy in that range. Anyways, that's one of the parameters we can play with.
Sorry, I'm gonna have to check out.
Thanks, David.
See you guys later.
Oh, thank you.
Bye.
So that's sort of a long rambling answer.
Oh, that's good. Sort of 50
in
to 100 -ish.
practice, yeah, in practice, 50 to 100-ish. In theory, at the beam line, it can do other things like the white beam, but that's too powerful for our purposes. That's used more commonly if you want to scan like an engine block or a huge boulder or something where you really need the flux and you're not too worried about working with really sensitive materials.
Yeah, if there's any hyperspectral cats out there that can figure out optimal energies from what we have, it'd be amazing.
Yeah, this is one of the most interesting, in my opinion, research questions that we're sitting just on the threshold of being able to answer. Like we have some of the data to start answering it, and we're very close to having really kind of amazing one-of-a-kind data sets to answer this.
As soon as we're gonna detect the first letters in scroll 3 or 4, we have more to speak about, I guess, because there we have many different energy levels for scans.
Right. And there's, we do have some of this data on some of the fragments we've released from 2019. So that's what I mean when we say some of this data set already exists. So if we want to do experimentation, or if anyone out there wants to do experimentation, we can use those fragments with their ground truth to do some sort of empirical measurements of how changing the scan parameters affects the downstream ink detection. One fun thing about this is the fact that there are so many steps between scan acquisition and the ultimate goal here, which is essentially ink detection. It's really nice when you're optimizing for something you can sort of measure on site while acquiring the scan, such as visual contrast. But in the case of this ink detection, what we have to do is acquire the scan and then come back home and segment it and run it through machine learning pipeline and so on. We don't, to date, have a really good pipeline set up that allows that to be like an interactive process at the scan facility, where we can quickly try a scan setting and immediately see how ink detection works. For example, try another scan setting, get feedback on ink detection. That would be amazing.
Is that actually possible at the facility? Like, with the amount of time it takes to choose energies and everything in the machine, is that something that I have no visualization of actually what happens there? Yeah,
that would be possible. It would require really quick turnaround on the computation. So we would need the ability, like one thing, for example, that we have now that we didn't have before is at least the ability to do quick partial reconstructions on site to verify that the scan we're presently acquiring is complete and reconstructs well and gives good looking slices.
Oh, nice.
Even that capability takes a lot of programming and scripting, basically. And so that was not always in place since the origin of doing this sort of scan for us. These scans really push the capabilities of the synchrotron. What we're doing is unusual because we want what, for these purposes, is considered quite a large object, which on its own is no problem. And we want it at a really high resolution, which on its own is no problem. But we want the entire large object at a high resolution, and that combination is unusual. And it means that a lot of the reconstruction pipeline that backs this so-called grid scan, if you've read into any of these papers where we talk about how this is acquired, we have to acquire the CT scan in pieces that are reconstructed together. And a lot of that logic was developed at the synchrotron for this project because they don't often need to do this. Usually people will have something really big and need low resolution, or they'll have something they want to look at in very, very high resolution, but the thing is small. So this combination is a fun one, hence all these data questions. Yeah.
Huh. Has anybody in the community looked at just the theoretical difference, subtle difference in the chemical composition of the soot they wrote with and a carbonized papyrus? Do we know if anybody's made any comments on that?
I don't know about our community. I know there is a lot of academic literature on this. So a lot of groups have looked at using some of the many thousands of open scroll fragments. A lot of study has tried to characterize the chemical composition of the ink against the papyrus.
Yeah.
Partially just for understanding. I mean, we can learn about, for historical reasons, we can just learn how the ink may have been made and things like that. But really the goal of a lot of these is if we can find a chemical contrast, it may be possible to design an imaging method that can hone in on that, right, in a penetrative way that would work for a rolled scroll. And from the literature that I've seen, the challenge is something that does both. So, for example, X-ray fluorescence will show you the atomic composition of the surface. So if you have a fragment with text on it, you can image it with scanning X-ray fluorescence, and for each pixel on the surface, you get sort of a readout of what elements are present. And you can look in that readout, which is essentially multispectral across the atomic table axis. You can look at which elements are present in the ink and in the papyrus, and you look for elements that give a contrast. So there have been examples of, and I would say across all these papers, I think maybe on the order of 100 fragments have been imaged in ways like this. And what we see is that sometimes there are clear chemical markers that differentiate them. Like calcium is one that sometimes shows up. Sometimes trace amounts of lead are present in the ink. And there are some others. The challenge is that since the scrolls are varied, as we were talking about earlier, none of these has been reliable across all fragments. It's like you might find one occasionally and it doesn't work on the other ones. That's like challenge A. And then challenge B is even if one of them was reliable, the imaging method relies on surface. It's not a penetrative imaging like CT that would necessarily work to just take this and apply it out of the box to a rolled scroll. But one thing there might be a path there. So if we discovered, for example, if it was true that lead was present in the ink consistently, you could design CT with that in mind and either capture 2 scans like multispectral on either edge of the energy where lead absorbs most.
Yeah.
So give like a lead tailored contrast scan is an approach that we actually have data attempting that, although we don't
Oh, wow.
observe a strong contrast because we know that if present at all, the lead is going to be trace.
Yeah.
But it may be enough of a difference to help the machine learning. I mean, this can be really subtle signal boosts. They don't have to exhibit strong visual
did you do that on?
contrast. I would have to go back and check. I think that may
Okay,
have
that's
been
fine.
done a little bit with some of these September scans that are currently rolling out.
Oh, wow. Huh.
So, and maybe also more in the past. Or there's been some experiments with people have brainstormed ideas, for example, to do dark field CT imaging, which is just a made up idea for this purpose, where what we do now is called basically bright field, which means we shine a bright X-ray through a thing and we look at that image of the beam shining through the thing, which is bright. So the detector is in the path of the beam. But if you take the detector and put it outside the path of the beam, you don't see the original incident X-ray. You see just the scattering X-rays that are fluoresced by the sample. So when the primary beam passes through the sample, most of the beam just continues on through the sample and hits the detector, which is what we do now. But some of those X-rays interact with the atoms in the scroll and they fluoresce. Characteristic X-rays off in any direction, the energy of which tells you something about the composition of the material. So this is tricky for all these reasons. Like you can't just do CT like that because when you just take an image of the beam, you actually get the geometry of that image. If you have a detector up here and you're just looking at the scattered X-rays, you're not getting an image anymore. So now you have to get like a really thin pencil beam. And basically, instead of getting a 2-dimensional projection of the thing, you have to work backwards to get CT voxel by voxel. So it becomes very time consuming and expensive. But something like that, in theory, could pick up much better on, for example, trace lead. Who knows?
Oh, that sounds amazing.
It would be amazing, wouldn't it?
Yeah, yeah, totally.
Certainly
I
ways
think
to go
too.
if we cannot read the scrolls, I guess.
What's that?
There's certainly options, like if our scanning abilities aren't good enough yet, there are options.
Yeah. Yeah, there's lots of exciting ideas. Another one is a multi-energy scan. So right now, the way we would approach this and the way it's done anywhere else is if you want multi-energy or if you want 2 scans that target some particular contrast, you would just acquire those separately and do the reconstructions separately. And then after the fact, if you wanted, you could combine those into a multi-channel data set that had not only 3 dimensions spatially, but also had like an energy dimension. But you still have to acquire each of those complete scans. And there's a lot of redundant information in so doing. Because you're taking like 5 different CT scans of the same object the structure of which doesn't change between scans. Like most of the information is shared between scans. It's really only the small differences that you're going to end up highlighting. So one thing you could do is for each, like during one scan, you just vary the energy for each projection image. And then you could reconstruct in a way that takes account of that, and it makes a single multi-channel reconstruction using multi-energy inputs. Now, none of that, the framework for that does not exist. Like the reconstruction pipelines don't do that today, but maybe in the future. I'm getting into the weeds on scanning things because it excites me. Sorry, everybody.
Yeah. Huh.
Santiago asked at some point, are the scrolls solid enough to withstand something like that? I think when we were talking about immersion in mercury, and the answer is no, that destroyed them. And what kind of substances did they try? At a minimum, mercury and rose water, but there were multiple others. I don't know off the top of my head.
Isn't there ethanol?
This
Isn't
is
that the
written
problem
about.
right now?
Probably.
Yeah.
All sorts of stuff has been tried. We're now in this really nice era of, I think the world, and certainly we all have faith enough that non-invasive methods at this point, it's clear that they will work. Our job is to get them to that point and get them to work, which is no easy thing. That's why we're all here, and it's a fun challenge. But we can all at least believe that someday you'll be able to take one of these scrolls and put it in some non-invasive imaging thing. Right now it's X-ray, and read them. So knowing that, or having faith that that will happen, pretty much halted all physical attempts to open these, which is good because they're quite destructive. And the non-invasive stuff is going to work.
I was watching those videos the other day where they were soaking them and then using tweezers to rip the scroll apart out in the UK. Oh my God.
Yeah, it's painful.
Yeah.
Even in the best circumstances, handling these scrolls at all, in a technical sense, is destructive. I mean, to even pick it up and set it back down, there will be a little bit of residue that's left behind inevitably. I mean, they're extremely, extremely fragile. And so we really want to minimize basically any handling at all, certainly attempts to open them. But even basic handling and transportation, it's best to be really cautious with and not do it unless you need to. I think we can wrap up soon. An hour seems like a good interval. We do have another question that we can talk about, which at least briefly, which is what are the cost controlling factors of scanning? Long term, it may turn out that we don't know yet because it remains possible new protocols or new approaches are developed for this. Today, the cost largely comes down to access to an instrument and then how long you need that instrument. And what I mean by that is you need to access some kind of CT scanner for this family of approaches. We're still using CT. So you either need a benchtop machine, which sits on a table, or you need a particle accelerator. Probably not to buy the whole thing and own it, but you need access to time at a particle accelerator. And both of those things cost money. So with a benchtop machine, you need to either buy one or rent time, and a particle accelerator, you most likely need to rent time. And then the main factors in cost at scale, the main factors become primarily just the acquisition time. That's one of the reasons the particle accelerator or the synchrotron is so nice, is that the scans are much, much quicker there. Not only can we currently achieve higher resolution there, the scan also goes much faster just because there's so much more X-ray. It's considered a brighter image or brighter source. So the exposure time of the individual projections is dramatically shorter. And that just means a really big scan of one of these scrolls can take on the order of an hour or some single digit number of hours, where to do this on a benchtop machine, first of all, we aren't aware yet of a design that gets quite the resolution we want, but even to get close requires days or weeks per scroll.
I think we even calculated like month.
Yeah, depending on how it's done, absolutely. I mean, if you wanted to, like, there are machines, there are benchtop instruments that, in theory, could more or less replicate what we've done at Diamond by tiling together multiple really small regions of interest at high resolution. So you do like a full CT scan of the scroll, but you're only capturing one really small region of interest at the target resolution. And then you just repeat that until you get each region of interest to fill the whole scroll. But it cubes with the scroll size. So it would need thousands of such scans. And like Julian's saying, it would be completely infeasible. It would take months for a single scan. So if anyone has any ideas, please let us know. For now, it seems like synchrotron's the best. And what we want to do now is to really hone in and develop the imaging protocol to know what the ideal settings are, which we spent a bit of time talking about today. We have the data now to answer that. So between our team and the community, one of my biggest goals for the next few months is to really dig into that question of which of these incident energies is best, or is there some combination that's best? Because in the past, what we've done when we scan a scroll is we scan it at under as many conditions as we can manage, basically, for this purpose, because we want to build that data set and understand the ideal parameters. But at scale, we don't want to scan every scroll under 8 different conditions. We want to just scan it once using what we know to be the best one, so that we can reduce the cost by a factor of 8 or whatever. So those are some of the factors. There are probably other ways to approach that question. Those are my thoughts. Okay. I can give a closing thought, but do either of you have any final thoughts or questions? I think we've answered all the questions I've seen come through.
Oh, just from segmentation team on the manual side, just would love to see different ways to help us manually segment the scrolls, and whether that's being able to get in off axis and rotate the data set in 3D, or be able to straighten it and then look at it again and just map back to do the computations, or 3D, or porting cubes into Cartez or whatever it is that allows us to get in and segment these apparently compressed regions that may not be so compressed off axis, and start doing that and start building more training data for machine learning and understanding and just understanding what's going on in the papyrus, because it's hard to tell what's going on just from this one axial view. We need to be able to look at it efficiently from different ways and be able to manipulate it. So anybody working on those things, thank you.
Yeah,
that's all.
it's important to remember it's 3D data. It's not 2D. It's 3D, and sometimes the sheets aren't following our expectations of just going up. They sometimes go to the side or something.
They're constantly at different angles.
Yeah.
I mean, especially in scroll 3, the whole thing's just doing this. And so we need some way to access it and manually. And so, some kind of 3D, being able to segment in 3D cubes manually, or being able to straighten it or change it off axis. Any way to do that, because scroll 1 was just this magical Goldilocks zone where most of it was straight and perfectly separated. It was lovely, but we don't have that luxury anymore. So we need more sophisticated tools, 100%. Yeah.
Just better accessibility for the data is very important, so that lots of people can just come and start working on this project.
Exactly.
That was going to be my concluding thought, is I think a big theme from the questions and from what I had wanted to get to talk about today anyways was the data and trying to make it as accessible. That's a good word for it. Just make it as accessible as possible. So on my front, that's something I'm going to be pushing in my own work, and I'll be reaching out to the community, and we will accept contributions to that end as well. But I think a lot of these new approaches we want to try rely on a nice foundation of accessible data sets. So we will get to work on that. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thanks, Ben and Julian and David, for joining me. We might do this more often, so let us know if you are in the community and watching this. If you enjoyed it, if you would come again, if there's a time that'd be better, we might try doing it on Discord sometime. Who knows? I think it's fun to interact with people, and these are good questions. So thank you all for participating. See you in the Discord.
All right.